and we'll be starting in just a moment.
This is Shel Wagner. I am online. A pretty good group of attendees. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar today. As you know, the Net Plus program is responsible for supporting campus identification, assessment, and eventual validation of cloud services that can provide a particular benefit to our university members. In this case, we're here today to talk about LabArchive. LabArchives and Internet2 have been working together for over a year now to develop a Net Plus offering that will meet the needs of all of our university participants. We have several presenters today. Dana Voss is the program manager from Internet2, and we'll be participating to bring you up to speed on where we stand with the Net Plus service itself, as well as members from LabArchives who will be presenting on the product, and from member campuses, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who have deployed the product. So I don't want to take too much of your time in an introduction, but we're really excited about the product, excited about the deployment, and seeing lots of interest from the community as we move from physical notebooks to digital notebooks. So let me turn it over to the team.
Thanks, Shel. My name is Matt Dooney. I'm one of the founders and the president of LabArchives. Quick background on LabArchives. LabArchives was founded in 2009 by a team of, we call ourselves veterans of scientific workflow software and scientific publishing. The companies that we had either started or built or ran over the years have been Research Information Systems, which was bibliographic management, RefWorks, which was a web-based bibliographic management company. We had Reference Update as part of Research Information Systems as well, which was a content awareness service for scientific researchers. GraphPad Prism, which is a curve-fitting software, distributed software out of the box, so to speak. Cambridge Scientific Abstracts, or CSA, which was a literature search service with 27 or 28 different literature databases, and ProQuest, which was scientific research aggregated journals. Under some of those monikers, we also had some primary journals that we published, as well as some other software programs targeted specifically towards scientific research and scientific workflow. We started LabArchives in 2009. Next slide, please. Specifically targeted towards academia. The reason why is we did a little bit of research, actually did a lot of research for about a year, and we learned that at that time about 97 or 98% of academic researchers, and that is defined as people in the business of doing research for academic institutions, for grants, for science, and interdisciplinary. 97% of those people were using paper notebooks at the time. If they weren't using paper, they were using very complex computer programs that were really written in computer ease versus research workflow, and they weren't really designed for workflow. They were designed as document management systems. So LabArchives, what is it? We go by the moniker as a product category as an ELN, electronic laboratory notebook. However, it's much more than a notebook, and it's not exactly a data storage facility either. It's a little bit of both. It's a secure, cloud-based, collaborative platform that's designed for the storage, organization, communicating, sharing, publishing of scientific research and data. It's a version-enabled product, meaning you can track versions, complete audit histories to the beginning of anybody's use in the system at an institutional or a lab level. It's a productivity tool. It has workflow tools built into LabArchives. Relative to productivity, what we do is we help researchers organize, search, view, edit, or their archive or their current notes, data protocols, resources. They could link out of LabArchives and go grab some references and bring them in. They can do a literature search in PubMed. There's calculators, inventory control systems for freezer boxes, for example, and it's completely extensible. It's a living repository, and living means everything that you do when you're in the platform can stay in the platform. You can go back to previous documents that you put in, edit them, add notes, posit questions, collaborate, and share. Next slide. Company history, mentioned that we were founded in 2009, came to market in 2010. 2011, we started the Classroom Edition, which is built on the same platform as the Professional Research Edition. It happens to have an added course manager and educational instruction module on top of the platform. Our customers actually asked us to create this Classroom Edition so it could be used in the business of lab instruction, under the theory that as students move from learning about science to application of science, they're using the same type of tool in the classroom as well as in the research lab. 2013, we added mobile apps, and back to 2012, forward to today, we have been engaged in the business of both individual end user sales as well as enterprise licenses. We have just over 120,000 users as of, I guess, last month. Next slide, please. So why do people use a lab notebook? Still very high percentage of researchers use paper. It's kind of ironic. It's a digital world. Most of the data that's captured is digital. It gets printed out and it gets pasted into a paper notebook versus loaded into a secure system that's designed for that purpose. People use a notebook for lots of reasons, among them to prove discovery, a complete record of who, what, when, why, thoughts about any one discovery. Many labs have their notebooks locked in lock and key in a safe in the lab. Many labs don't, and therefore the notebook walks. It's to protect intellectual property at the institutional level or at the investigator researcher level. It's a place to collect and organize incredible amounts of digital research data. It can be used as a forum to document research thoughts, collaborate with colleagues, comment on other people's work that you're collaborating with, etc. It's also, and this has come up much more recently in a bigger way, provide a path for replication of research. In today's research world, replication seems to be a big reason, while papers are reason that papers are retracted from time to time in peer-reviewed publishing. It helps users comply with institutional or regulatory or funding agency research policies, and it also helps an institution maintain research integrity. You can go to the next slide, please. Lab notebook, the research integrity comment is that a lab notebook provides a record of the research and who did the research. So if there is ever a research issue, research academic fraud issue, one can use, and it's at the institutional level, the notebook to prove or disprove discovery, fraud, and provide credit for the proper people. LabArchives hits 4 out of the 5 big areas of the scientific research cycle, and this chart on the right-hand side of the slide is an attempt to show that. The one area we don't really touch is when you want to identify the research work you're going to perform or that you endeavor to perform. We help with the documentation and articulation of the design of the research study, the experiments. We help gather the data, annotate the data, manage your research. We help with the analysis of the results, and we help with the publishing or sharing process, either in the form of pushing it out to the world in general, to a secure group, intra-institution or intra-lab, or as supplemental data with a perpetual link for academic papers, for supplemental data. We enable the management of institutional data at the institutional level. We endeavor to help enhance the research workflow. We help lab instructors lower student costs by using electronic versus paper and print, and facilitate laboratory instruction with the course management capabilities. And we manage or help manage data management plans, protect intellectual property, and execute research audits, and maintain data security. With that, I think we go to Shell.
Great. Yeah, I did want to touch, Matt. I think, you know, the reason that we selected LabArchive as part of this project was because a number of campuses recognized the challenge of providing a tool that was both readily usable and consumable by existing PIs, faculty, graduate students, and something that would meet all of the, I would say commercial, but I guess it's more grant-oriented requirements, things that are imposed on institutions and PIs that can be really challenging. And in the past, the obligations associated with those in a non-digital era were managed as an exception basis. You had to make sure you documented anything. You had to be able to provide that after the fact if needed in an audit or otherwise. Today, the obligations are just much, much higher, and as much as we would like to keep it as streamlined and smooth as possible, we do have to make sure that we are meeting all of those requirements. And so a tool like yours that was selected by the community was done in great part because we wanted to help you continue to design something that was going to continue to evolve over time to meet both the requirements, the obligations that we have to make, but make it usable, make it really part of the workflow, make it part of something that PIs will be happy to use, as opposed to a compliance engine. I spent 10 years as the CIO at UC Berkeley, and you know, there was nothing quite so onerous as saying to a faculty member, oh, and I have a new tool for you that you must use to do effort reporting, or you must use to do data management. The must-use requirement piece inevitably dies on the vine, whereas the want-to-use, because it makes their day jobs that much better and really helps them in their science, is what we were looking for. And that's really why we partnered with LabArchives, because that's what the community saw the opportunity to do in your product. So now we're going to hear from one of those community members. As I mentioned before, at Wisconsin, they have actually deployed, so I'll turn it over to Jan, who can talk us through Wisconsin's experience.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jan Cheatham from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm the Research Cyber Infrastructure Liaison there in the Office of the CIO. I'm also the site administrator for our LabArchives instance and one of the service team members. So can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Marie. So our campus has been involved with electronic lab notebooks for more than 5 years now. We started back in 2011. A faculty member approached us and said, I need an electronic lab notebook. Could you host one for me? And we, at that time, it was an isolated faculty member, but we started talking to other folks on campus, and we kind of learned that paper was working pretty well for most people about 5 or 6 years ago, but it was hard to find things in notebooks, and also people were having to keep both a paper record and an electronic record because of the digital data issue, and also just because it didn't make sense not to keep a digital record. So people were kind of keeping redundant records at the time. So we set up a pilot with 2 different products, and we recruited about 60 people to participate. They used one or the other of these 2 products for 3 months to record their research. And we found at the end of 3 months that all of them wanted to continue using an electronic lab notebook. And we had also gathered some interested folks on campus as well, and by that time we had about 200 people who said they were interested in using an electronic lab notebook. So we headed into a request for proposals, evaluated proposals, and ended up in late 2014 signing a site license for the professional edition of LabArchives. So our site license is for our entire campus, for the researchers on the campus. The classroom edition we do use in several courses, but our site license doesn't include that, so students pay for the use of that themselves. Our implementation is really framed around our campus data stewardship policy, which is kind of indicated on the right there. So you can see it's a pretty general policy, but you can see in the bracketed area there that it stipulates that the principal investigator should adopt an orderly system of data organization, access, and retention, and determine the access and use appropriate to each lab member's role and their contribution to the data. So that's a really good fit with a lot of the roles and rights that are set up within LabArchives, but we wanted to ensure that only principal investigators could decide to adopt it, that it wasn't something that their students started using without their knowledge. And so our integration, we're a Shibboleth institution, we included an additional step of integration with Grouper using an entitlement property in Shibboleth is member of. And that meant that we had to authorize anyone to access the platform. And the way we set that up was a principal investigator would decide to adopt the system, fill out a form listing all their lab members, and then we would authorize everyone. So our current implementation includes researchers from all science disciplines across campus. I would say our highest uptake is in our College of Ag and Life Sciences, and also some of the basic science labs in our School of Medicine and Public Health. We have not, as a campus yet, though, decided to bless it as a system for restricted personal health information kinds of data. Because of the way that we set it up, authorizing essentially one lab at a time, we also established a system of lab onboarding. So when a PI signed up for a lab account, we offered to come and meet with their lab group, and many took us up on this. And it was a great opportunity to meet all members of the lab and to sort of get them going on the lab notebook. So we covered a long script of things. In fact, we have a 12-page script that we used for these onboarding meetings, which I'd be glad to share with anyone if they're interested. But in it, we reminded them of the data stewardship policy and also other security policies on campus regarding restricted data, securing devices, making sure that they use the virtual private network when they were off campus. We explained the roles and notebook ownership. Often during these meetings, it was possible to even create notebooks and add members to them. We demonstrated features. We asked them about the kinds of files that they have, talked about where they stored them, really encouraged them to store as many as possible in the ELN, but also keep a backup on another location. Then we described the export formats out of LabArchives and talked about options for scheduling regular backups or exporting out the full set of files on a regular schedule as well. And it was also a good chance to talk about some of the data management kinds of details. Things like using tags, structured vocabularies with tags, keeping track of versions of things, annotating images, and also things like when to create a new entry for a data file that is the original data file versus one that had been analyzed. And it was also a great opportunity to just answer lots of questions. So when we look at our uptake, our adoption trends at Wisconsin, we're sort of looking at the lab perspective again. And we've noticed that after about 20 months, I would say, of our implementation, some patterns have begun to emerge. And these are summarized in this pie chart here. So one of the things that we found was a category we're calling an established lab, shown in the purple pie slice at the bottom. So these are labs where almost everyone is using the notebook and have been for more than a year. And so a lot of these are PIs who were very interested. Some of them had already been using electronic lab notebooks. One lab had been using LabArchives even before we set up our implementation. They were champions during the pilot, and so they really had bought into this, and they really had lab-wide commitment amongst all their lab members. The next category is the gray one, the upper left. So that's, we're calling an uptake lab. And what we find there is not all, but several lab members are using the notebook after 6 months or more. Then the green slice represents new labs, so labs that we've onboarded in the last 4 or 5 months. They could turn out to be established labs where there's lab-wide commitment to using it. And finally, the lone user, the blue pie slice on the right. Those are labs that we onboarded in the usual way, many of them over a year ago, and now there's only one person in the lab who's using the product. So you can see this is a good synopsis, I think, of some of the lab cultures. And so some of the things that we're thinking about too is kind of what drives adoption. So certainly the PI can be a driver, and what we've noticed is that many of the adopters are junior faculty. Not all of them, of course, but definitely there's a strong interest amongst junior faculty. We've even had a few brand new faculty ask about the ELN. But even though our implementation doesn't allow students to join directly because of the way we have it integrated with Grouper, we're finding that students are drivers too. So they often become aware of the ELN and ask their PI to sign up for it. And we're finding that sometimes a real incentive for using it is when there are a lot of undergraduates being mentored in a lab. People are considering it's a great tool for mentoring undergrads. And we also have heard from a few labs where undergraduates who joined their lab who had used LabArchives in a class introduced the product to the lab, and the other members of the lab started using it too. Another thought is that once more and more institutions start having enterprise ELN systems, that will be probably a driver. I know that at least one of our long-term PIs who's been using it for quite a while started using it when he learned that a colleague at Duke was using it. That was a good incentive for him. We find that word of mouth really helps to spread the benefits of using the product. We know that people hear about it from labs down the hall. When we first rolled out our implementation, someone who had been using it for a while emailed his entire department, let them know that it was available now and that he and his lab had been using it and highly recommended it. And that of course ended up being our department with the greatest uptake. But one thing I will note is that adoption takes time. So I think it takes time at the level of the lab. Often when we look at usage data, we can see that a lab we onboarded may take several months before we can actually really see much activity and they appear to be using it. I think it just takes time to take up a new practice. And we've recently started a user group of site admins with enterprise LabArchives accounts, and we met just last month and talked a lot about adoption, and it was really helpful to kind of hear how adoption's going at other institutions. And I think I would summarize across the institutions and again say it takes some time. Some institutions who are just rolling it out are kind of intentionally rolling it out sort of slowly to build on success. And so I think we may be just looking at innovation and the innovation that takes a while to spread. One of the things I didn't show you in my pie chart are the labs that we onboarded and then several months later noticed nobody was using it at all. So that of course happens, and one thing that we're doing right now is going back to those groups and seeing if we can get them to articulate why it didn't work for them. I'm expecting that we'll hear a range of different responses. I think in some cases it's probably not an immediate fit with the discipline. I know we've heard that a lot about people who do computational kinds of research, for example, bioinformatics. They seem to feel that there's a need to be able to view code snippets within the environment, and they are finding that code repository types of tools like Confluence and GitHub are better suited for what they're doing. We know that some researchers prefer other systems, more ELN-like systems, and I'm expecting that we'll hear some people say, well, it doesn't have a feature or an affordance that we need. Again, I think researchers can be resistant to change for a variety of reasons, so I'm expecting to hear a range of different things there. And again, I think it has a lot to do with lab culture and having a PI who's driving it, or kind of having it, you know, come from the bottom up, having the students really wanting to adopt it. So one of the things that we have done recently is do some interviews with those labs that were in the established lab group, the folks where almost everyone is using it and they've been using it for longer than a year. We wrote a story for the news site on our campus, hoping that success stories would help drive adoption. And so I wanted to share some of the things that we heard from these folks. And they sort of fall into about 3 different themes. I think the PIs themselves are finding, after using the ELN, that they have better insight into the activities of their labs. The graduate students and postdocs are saying it's a game changer, and all lab members really are seeing benefits in being able to access, organize, and share information. So one of the PIs we talked to is Tim Hall in medical physics. So his lab had been using LabArchives for more than a year before we launched our enterprise service. And so his lab has been using it for 3 years or more. And what he said is it lets him stay up to date on where things are headed and where we really are in our research. So sort of stepping back and seeing the big picture and seeing what's working and, you know, into all the different projects where things are going. Eric Yen in nutritional science, another PI, found that it's really reassuring to be able to see that everyone is keeping their notebook in a standard format using the templates they created. So the oversight that it gives him is a benefit. And, you know, otherwise he'd be collecting paper lab notebooks from time to time and trying to keep up with what people are doing. But this really keeps him better in touch. Mark Golub, who's a graduate student in biomechanical engineering, noted some things that I think are just sort of basic improvements when you move away from paper. So he notes that he can share or type anything, upload all his data and protocols, and he doesn't have to print and tape manually into his notebook anymore. Mark also mentioned that handwriting is no longer an issue, and he's the one who said this is a game changer. So even those things that seem almost like no-brainers when you go paperless are really, you know, they're really significant, I think, for the students. Then Lindsay Moser, who's a postdoc in pathobiological sciences in our School of Veterinary Medicine, noted that it's useful to be able to write in the ELN from home so she can do planning and thinking through results. Again, there's a standard taboo in labs against taking the paper lab notebook out of the lab. It's something that you keep in the lab inside a desk drawer or on the shelf, but you never remove it. And as you can imagine, that really limits your ability to access your data from all the places where you'll need to access it. Then a couple of others, Fernando Moreira, who's a graduate student in pathobiological sciences, indicated that he can now record exactly how he sets up his protocols so he can reproduce it next time. He does work with mosquito cultures, and so I think some of the ways he sets up the cultures are vary from experiment to experiment, and what he's now able to do is capture the protocols with digital photos, something that he just probably wasn't easy to do when he was keeping a paper notebook, but it's so easy to take photos and put them in the lab notebook, and they can really make a difference when you start recording something that you hadn't been before. Ivan Rosado Mendez in medical physics talked about organizing his research puts things in perspective and makes it easier for him to jump between studies and get new ideas. So Ivan is from the lab of Tim Hall. He was the first PI that we saw whose lab has been using it for more than 3 years, and I think it's kind of interesting that both of them really talk about this kind of big picture that emerges when you've got things in a digital notebook, the kind of thing you really can't see when you're just page turning through paper lab notebooks. And finally, David Nelson in nutritional science talked about the ELN being the most efficient way for him to share information with people who are not in the lab. So he was talking about labs down the hall, across campus, and labs at other institutions. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about research data management. Matt talked about it in some detail too, but for us, I think research data management is a really important reason for having an enterprise electronic lab notebook. It's really with LabArchives, as Matt said, we have an environment that spans the research life cycle. And so one thing that we're always trying to do is make this apparent to researchers. Researchers aren't always thinking about data management in the context of keeping a lab notebook. And so here are some of the things that we tell them in this kind of big picture view. Inside the dashed box, it represents sort of the interior of the electronic lab notebook. And you can see at the top that we can upload and attach data files to it. We can create other types of entries with data in them, like LaTeX or chemical structures. We can create rich text entries, and from the rich text entries, we can link to files that may be stored on a permanent server, shown in the bottom of this diagram. We can also, there are also automated workflows for pushing data files into the lab notebook. So for example, if you look at the top where the blue arrows are, a data file produced by an instrument, for example, may get moved onto a lab server, and then from the lab server, you can push it directly into the ELN using Folder Monitor, sort of a plug-in to LabArchives. Other plug-ins to LabArchives for, say, Microsoft Office, FlowJo, GraphPad, Prism, those can also be set up to push files directly into the notebook. And of course, photos that you take on a mobile device or other kinds of files can be directly moved into the lab notebook. And once they're in the lab notebook, attached data files, you can keep track of different versions, you can annotate them, there's provenance information that's recorded. So it's really good, a really good record of the discovery process. And then outside, thinking outside the lab notebook for the periodic backups that we recommend that researchers do, or the archiving of the or the long-term archiving of the data. There are two export options, one of them being what's called the offline notebook, which is all the attached files plus HTML versions of the pages, or there's a more human-readable version, which doesn't include the attached data files. So it's great to have all the data stored in the cloud in LabArchives, but as institutions, of course, we have to be thinking about long-term archiving. So a lab notebook is something people keep for years and years, and our data stewardship policy stipulates that it's at least 7 years, but of course most people keep them longer. And so we really have to be thinking about keeping everything that's recorded in it sort of safely at home on campus as well. And of course, an electronic lab notebook in LabArchives consists of about 4 different types of files. So we saw these on the previous slide. There are notebook pages and entries and folders. There are attached data files. There are data files that are only linked to from the lab notebook, and then there's metadata or data about data, and that includes things like the timestamp, the tags, and annotations that might have been captured. So all of these things need to be retained, and at our institution, we're still at the beginning of this. Our institutional repository, for example, is not a place where we can push everything. It may be an okay place for PDF versions of notebooks, but all the data files and all the other materials, we're just not really set up for that. So that's something that we're looking into. There are probably still some questions that we need to be asking. For example, all these parts and pieces, if we, these 4 data types, do they include everything that we need to be preserving? So one thing is attached data files. Some of them are too large, perhaps, or too numerous for us to easily keep on institutional archives. Linked data files, they're kind of the weak link in the lab notebook because, of course, if the files move, then the links are broken and can't be resolved. So there's still a lot of work that we need to do at our end to be ready to archive long-term for the amount of time that we need to. And finally, I'd like to talk just a little bit about sharing and public access, because I think that's another thing that organizations and institutions are thinking about a lot. So LabArchives has a way of creating a digital object identifier. I think Matt mentioned that, so that's a way of pointing to a complete notebook, the pages, the data files, whatever the researcher wants to make public on the LabArchives platform. But there are probably some other ways that we could think about sharing some of the export options in other ways in addition to the digital object identifiers. One thing is we could think about perhaps a way of creating standard templates for pages that could be included in public databases or registries. For example, fact sheets about chemical compounds or materials. We could be producing those using a template in LabArchives and then pushing those out as part of a deposition into a public database. We can also think about the HTML package that includes the data file and the PDF export going into someday institutional repositories. So I think I mentioned ours is not ready for that yet. However, I know there's some really great work that's being done at University of Edinburgh with a handoff, an automated handoff between a lab notebook, an electronic lab notebook, and their institutional repository there. So I know we're all going to be looking to that as a great example. But then there are also some other places where data can be shared publicly. So things like Figshare or Data Dryad. And so some of these other export options might be more easily shared, I think, by researchers in some of those contexts. So I think that's my last slide, and now I'm handing this over to Dana.
Thank you, Jen, and yes, thank you. I'm Dana Voss, Program Manager with Internet2, and I have been working with LabArchives and my university colleagues for the last couple of years. We started the validation of LabArchives in 2014. We worked with Cornell University. They were the sponsor for LabArchives, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Caltech. And as you probably know, as part of the Internet2 Net Plus program, Internet2 partners with member institutions who identify and validate cloud solutions that they believe meet their needs and have the potential to scale, benefiting all the member institutions' teaching, learning, and research needs. LabArchives went through that rigorous evaluation process in 2014. As part of that process, we worked on a functional assessment of the service. We looked at the security aspects, identity. We worked with University of Wisconsin-Madison in particular on a very rigorous compliance assessment. And also the group of schools negotiated the business model and the best possible pricing and terms. So what that means is that when you sign up for Net Plus LabArchives through the Internet to Net Plus program, you get the benefits of the work that the universities have done back in 2014. Just like any other Net Plus service in the Net Plus catalog, LabArchives is now available for adoption because they did pass this peer-driven service evaluation process. So some considerations to keep in mind are that the service runs on the Internet2 network. It is identity compliant. It meets our in-common requirements. We do have all the information related to security on file. Internet2 follows the Cloud Controls Matrix assessment tool, which was developed by the Cloud Security Alliance. So we took LabArchives through that security process. And also, as I mentioned, the pricing and terms have already been negotiated in service validation, which is a benefit for universities interested in taking advantage of the Net Plus LabArchives service offering, and with that, of course, you get most favorable pricing. The Net Plus LabArchives service is available to Internet2 members only, so that's something to keep in mind. And the other aspect, which is very important, of the LabArchives service offering is the option to be a part of the Net Plus LabArchives Advisory Board. We have been working over the last couple of years very closely with Jan at Wisconsin and representatives from Cornell University and Caltech. We are actually adding a couple of new members to the LabArchives Advisory Board. These are schools who have subscribed to LabArchives over the last year or so. So that's another benefit. As part of the advisory board, you get an opportunity to help shape the direction of the service and also be a part of discussions that are taking place around the roadmap and other strategic and operational items related to where LabArchives is going. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in LabArchives, there are a couple of different ways to get more information. If you go to the Internet2 website, you'll find information about LabArchives there. You can contact us at netplus@internet2.edu, or you can contact LabArchives directly. They'll be happy to do a demo for you and share any other information that you're interested in, pricing, or answer any questions that you might have. With that, I'm going to hand it over to LabArchives for a live demo.
Here. Okay, in the time remaining, I'm going to give you a very, very high-level overview of LabArchives. As Dana mentioned, if you wanted a more detailed demo, we would be happy to provide that for you. What you're looking at on my screen right now is an example of a lab notebook that's been configured for a Chesapeake Water survey. We provide a great deal of flexibility in how you can use the notebooks, and I did want to point out that even though lab is in the product title, I did want to point out this is not just limited to bench science. We do have folks who can use this in the field because we do have mobile apps. It certainly is applicable to social science. So it's a very flexible platform that allows you to do all the things that have been described thus far. In this example, I just want to point out we do use a folder hierarchy for structuring and organizing your information. It's completely up to you how you organize this. The model is that the PI is the owner, quote unquote, of the lab notebook, but I did want to point out that all the rights of data are conferred to the institution. But we use that model for the PI to be able to add members, create notebooks and add members to them so that the PI always has that ability to have a view into the notebooks. And that kind of follows on some of the feedback that Jan had received from PIs at her institution. But it's very well organized, it's very adaptable. So when it comes time to adding data to the notebook, I want to show you that you can have pages where your data is organized. In this example here, folks, let me expand this out further. As Jan was describing, and I don't have a lot of time to be able to walk you through the actual mechanics of it, but as you can see, you build out a page, and in this survey notebook, we've got a page where we're collecting data for January 2nd, and the data may be photographs, and that's what it is in this case. We've dragged and dropped attachments onto the page. As Jan mentioned, you can annotate these and edit these further. It could have been, you could drag and drop or add attachments to the page of any type that you would want to add. You can also we have a variety of different types of entry styles that we have available. In addition to adding files to the page, you can add rich text entries to the page, and that's a great benefit so that you can see you're actually adding your either methodology, observations, and so forth, so that you can wind up with entries such as this, where you've got all the background information. So it's not just a place to stash data files. It really is about putting down the research information. So it's repository for that. It's also an ability, as was being discussed, of collaborating with other people that you are working with. So the people who have access to this particular notebook have access, and it's based on the access rights determined by the PI, but we can collaborate and work together on different aspects of this. So certainly you can have these rich text entries as we're looking at this. We provide options for tools to just organize the information on the page. You can certainly drag and drop charts and other attachments onto the page, and we have a wide variety of different tools that are available that I'm not going to be able to go into with the time allowed. But I did want to point out we do have customizable features as well. So we have tools that we call widgets that can be used off the shelf for organizing materials, such as an inventory here, as you're seeing here, and different folks have edited this to determine where the different material is. But these tools can also be customized to create some of your own types of widgets, perhaps for a template or a protocol. And again, that goes to some of the best practices with regard to research data management, where material is being well organized, it's well defined, and for reproducibility, if you're using templates and everyone's using data or storing the data or the research results in a consistent format, it really helps with that whole reproducibility issue. Now, in addition to all the tools we have for adding data to the page, and you can see here at the very top of the page, we've got our attachment, office documents, and so forth that can be added. We've got a lot of options here. But what I want to point out, it's not just about in terms of the tools we have, but it's important to note with regard to what type of data can be added. LabArchives is 21 CFR Part 11 and HIPAA compliant. And although many people do not put in the personally identifiable data in, they may use an ID system, it's important to note that we do have that HIPAA compliance. It also supports FERPA compliance. And very recently, we also have our 508 compliance statement with a full VPAT that's available for universities on our compliance. So that's an important part of this in terms of knowing what type of data, not only the tools, how to add it, but what can be added. Now, after data has been added to the notebook, let me jump back here to another page, you certainly have options for managing the information. So again, we looked at this page where you have a rich text entry with images that have been inserted and so forth, but I wanted to point out we give you some metadata options, one of which is tagging. That's very important and excellent part of research data management. As you create tags within LabArchives, you are building a controlled vocabulary that then can be used by all the members who have access to this notebook. So again, it's that consistency. We're all using similar tags and so forth rather than idiosyncratic type of information. Not only are these important for research data management, but they also provide an option for searching and finding entries within the notebook, either by simply clicking on a tag that's been added or certainly using our advanced search feature, which is definitely a benefit that you get. Certainly not something you've got with paper notebooks, and is great, almost a meta-research activity in and of itself as notebooks become more and more rich and data dense, because you can search across multiple notebooks. So even though you may be looking for one topic, you can find out how that topic's being addressed in different contexts. In addition to tagging, I think Jan mentioned there's a link out, so you can imagine where you use this link feature here to link out either to another page or entry in this notebook or to an external web address. That's where you could link to an external data set if you wanted to do that, or certainly a URL. Now, another thing that's very important with regard to how we store the entries and the content that you add to the notebook, every single entry that is added, you're probably noticing this on the screen, has a date and time stamp. This is for every entry that's created, as well as every single modification. We base that on the National Institute of Standards and Technology timestamp service that we use. So everything has a complete audit trail. In fact, for each entry, I can click on the revisions history. That one's not as exciting. Let me go up to this upper one. I want to show you a history that really has some detailed history, and there you go. This is the complete audit history for this entry that we're looking at. I can see when it was first created, who created it, their IP range, what they did. I could even revert to this earlier version without deleting any of these other subsequent versions. So that's a huge benefit that you get in terms of an audit trail, and that's a big part, again, of research data management, and certainly a great security for institutions if they ever had to do any investigation with regard to academic fraud. Wrapping up very quickly, I do want to point out that in addition to adding the data, managing the data, we give you a lot of flexibilities in terms of managing access to the notebooks. So certainly a PI can add members and they have complete access to the entire notebook, but I did want to point out that we give you the ability to share entries in the notebook with people who may not be a standard part of the research team. They may not even be at your institution. And we give you the ability to share entries, either individual entries, pages, folders, and so forth, to people who are considered with the role of guest in the notebook. I know that's getting a little bit into the weeds, but essentially they do not have to have a paid subscription. They are required to create an account, so you can know that they are authorized to have access. You've invited them and they are the person who's coming through. But this allows that collaboration. Perhaps you need to share this with someone for a short period of time, and you need them to have access just to this one part. That allows you to control access. Who's getting access to the parts that should be public and shared, but what's being protected in terms of your IP. It allows you to straddle both those worlds. And as we mentioned, you can create DOIs. As you can see here, one of the other links, the option to create DOIs to support publishing efforts. And with all these different features, I wanted to point out that security is a paramount issue for us. Oftentimes with a lot of flexibility and features like this, you have to sacrifice security, but that's not the case here. So we use Amazon Web Services for our servers. We provide bank level security, We use SSL and full-time HTTPS security for all our users. And data is encrypted at rest and in transit, so from the server to from the browser to our servers. So we do have all those security measures, and we do interact with institutions, single sign-on services, as Jan was mentioning, going through Shibboleth. So I breezed through LabArchives demo very, very quickly, but I wanted to wrap that up in the interest of time. Thank you again, everyone, for attending the session today. Shell, if you're still on the line, did you want to make any final statements?
No, I want to thank everybody for your participation. The session has been recorded. We'd encourage you to share it with your colleagues, so we'll be posting it at the Internet2 site as well as LabArchives. So if you have peers or colleagues at other institutions who are interested in this space, we would encourage you to send that link out to them, and so you'll be receiving a copy of that link via the regular mail stream. Thank you.